Welcome everyone to day 2, the NSB's 477th meeting. And today we're pleased to continue panel discussions around the Vision 2030 Geography of Innovation theme. This has already included a look last year at the important role community colleges play in opening doors to STEM talent. And in December, at the uneven geography of K through 12 STEM education. Today, we turn to partnerships and the role they have on regional development and innovation. And I'll ask fellow board member Roger Beachy to launch today's panel. Roger.
Thank you, Ellen. Welcome everyone to the session. My apologies for arriving late. I don't even have my talking points in front of me, so I'm going to wing it here. This is part of an ongoing process of the board to learn more about the issues that are important to us as described in the Vision 2030 document. As you recall, one of those was the importance of ensuring that geography of education, geography of innovation, and other components that we are concerned about are widespread across the U.S. And we have, over the last several meetings, had discussions around education, and the first one around geography. And today the program goes one more step, and we've asked individuals around the country from different perspectives and having accomplished different kinds of milestones in their regions to tell us what worked and what perhaps didn't work in their regions. And we have an outstanding group of panelists gathered by members of the NSBO and through the work of Dario and I, and we are grateful for the work of Alexandra and others on her committee. But rather than going further into the descriptions, I'll turn this over to our colleague on the board, Dario Gill, who will tell us more about the panelists. And we have left adequate time in this panel for discussions. In speaking with them earlier, we know that they have much to tell us, and we will have many questions for them. So we hope that you find this as informative as we. Dario, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Roger. It's been a pleasure to collaborate with you and NSB staff on preparing this panel, and we really, are going to have an exciting time and plenty of time to have a vigorous discussion. Geography is a cornerstone of NSB's and NSF goals for an improved domestic science and engineering enterprise. In our Vision 2030, we stated that Americans from every state must benefit from the progress of science and engineering and have access to high quality STEM education and science and engineering careers. NSB's recently released Keystone Policy Brief reaffirms that we must leverage the local science and engineering assets and capabilities that already exist in every state to strengthen our global standing and ensure that Americans have access to the science and engineering enterprise. Today's panel builds on our August panel on community colleges as essential talent hubs and our December panel that highlighted the uneven geography of K through 12 STEM education. We'll be talking about today, successful innovation partnerships require STEM talent and more. Today's panelists will highlight data, investment strategies, community culture, and different ways to think about innovation partnerships around technological needs, workforce needs, and critical or time-sensitive needs. Each panelist will speak for 5 minutes, after which we will have a Q&A session. Our first panelist is Simon Johnson. Simon is the Ronald Kurtz Professor of Entrepreneurship at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He co-authored Jumpstarting America: How Breakthrough Science Can Revive Economic Growth and the American Dream. Simon will talk about catalysts of regional scientific development and how to promote economic growth with scientific partnerships. Our second panelist, Doug Grose, is the chairman of the board of New York Creates, which partners with SUNY Polytechnic Institute in creating the Northeast Advanced Technology Education Center. The center focuses on the research and development of next-generation microchips and workplace development. Doug will be speaking about how New York Creates came to be and how it has leveraged an extensive educational network and numerous stakeholders in the New York area. And our third panelist is Hank Weber, Most recently, Hank was the Executive Vice Chancellor for Civic Affairs and Strategic Planning at the Washington University in St. Louis. There, he helped establish the Cortex Innovation Community, an anchor-led inclusive growth model, which transformed the Washington University campus and led to economic growth and an increased focus on education and training of underrepresented students. Hank will tell us about the Cortex innovation journey. Our final panelist is Barbara Helland. Barb is Associate Director of the Office of Sciences Advanced Scientific Computing Research Program at the Department of Energy, where she also leads the Exascale Computing Initiative. Barb will share with us her work as the Executive Director of the COVID-19 High Performance Computing Consortium, an international, multi-collaborative, quick-moving partnership with a unique model for innovation. At the end of the presentations, we will invite board members to turn their cameras back on and start the Q&A. I will now turn to Simon to start his presentation. Simon?
Thank you very much, Dario. Can you see my slides yet?
Yes.
Great. If you put those, thank you. So as Dario kindly said, my name is Simon Johnson, and I wrote a book in 2019 with Jonathan Gruber, also from MIT, called Jumpstarting America, which is absolutely focused about today's topic, which is the overlap and overlay between science spending and the creation of new technology and geography. Next slide, please. So in that book, we look back to the beginnings of modern public funding for science in the United States, which was really in 1940. And of course, 1950, with the creation of the NSF, was a major milestone. One of the big things that's changed over the past 70 or 80 years is that our leading places of innovation have become increasingly concentrated in just a few mega hubs on the West Coast and on the East Coast. This picture shows a very nice graphic developed by Jed Kolko, where he compared the types of jobs that are listed, vacancies that are listed in the tech sector with San Francisco, and you get a darker red in your circle if you are more like San Francisco in terms of your job market. This illustrates the point that there are a few places where a lot of technology is created and where many of the tech jobs are concentrated. Perhaps that's a good thing, perhaps that's a bad thing, but it's definitely a feature of the modern economy that wasn't there before. Next slide. And this leads to my main points. First of all, and we don't have time to go into this today, but happy to expand on it separately. There's an overwhelming economic case for more public support for research and development. The federal government did very little of this before 1940. In the light of a major international crisis and a subsequent view on the nature of the Cold War, that spending increased, generating a great deal of additional economic output and really good jobs. But that funding peaked in the mid-1960s at around 2% of GDP, and it's now fallen back consistently under 0.7% of GDP. So in the book, we argue for increasing that. Now, why do we need the public sector to support this? Well, the reason is that while the private sector is good at some kinds of innovation and venture capital is happy to fund some kinds of risks, they don't want to take on the kinds of basic science that you fund, because that generates a lot of useful spillovers that are frankly hard to commercialize, at least from the perspective of the original venture capitalist. So they pass on projects like the Human Genome Project, which had enormous spillover effects and which helped and saved many people over the past 2 years. Private sector was offered that as a VC investment in the 1980s. They said no. It became a federal government initiative and one of the most successful scientific transformations of the modern era. But here comes the geography. And this is I think, the problem that we have to overcome, which is we have restricted housing supply in those mega hubs. And that means that it's very hard to move to San Francisco or New York or Boston if you're a young person or if you're a person who doesn't have a high degree of education, not already earning a high income. This slows down economic growth. It delays innovation. Some estimates are this has lowered US growth rate by up to a third since the 1960s. That's a very big impact. It also means, to your point earlier, Dario, there are many young people around the country who are called, referred to sometimes as the lost Marie Curies and the lost Einsteins, who never get to participate fully in the conveyor belt that lifts people up and allows them to become technology creators and the leaders of the next scientific breakthroughs. Now, there is, I think, a great potential here, and this is a problem that absolutely can be fixed. And to your point also, Dario, about the depth and breadth of regional interest here, there is legislation currently before Congress. We could discuss the details if you want, but there was a key vote, and I think an indicative vote in June 2021 on a piece of legislation was then called the Endless Frontiers Act, which included the idea that more scientific research should be pushed into creating new hubs. I'll come to that in a moment. Key point, though, is that 68 senators from 41 states voted in favor of this legislation. So there's a lot of people out there who want to participate if we can bring the geography and the science together. And last slide, please. This is the picture I'd like to leave you with. This is also available on our website, which is called jumpstartingamerica.com. This takes an index that John Gruber and I developed and says, okay, where are the places that could become the next tech hubs? There's 102 of them. They're in 36 states. It's about science programs. It's about college-educated populations. It's also about quality of life, and it's about available land and being able to build. And if you don't like our index, you think we got the weights wrong, you can go to the website. It's interactive. Make your own index, change the weights. You will get very similar pictures in terms of where are the next opportunities to build scientific hubs. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. I'm sure we're going to have an opportunity to have a lot of dialogue on these topics. Next, we have Doug. Doug, as soon as your presentation is up, please go ahead.
Thank you, Dario. In the next few minutes, what I'd like to focus on is the semiconductor industry. Semiconductors are very critical to our everyday life, our businesses, and national security. And it's a $550 billion worldwide industry that's growing at about 8 to 10% a year. Now, global semiconductor companies invest about 20% of their revenues in research and development. And this research and development and manufacturing are really at the core of the industry's relentless drive for advancement. Now, the industry, unfortunately, has been in the news a lot lately due to chip shortages, which have been closing factories that make a wide variety of products. Now, the other problem here is the US share of manufacturing, which is highly capital intensive, has been shrinking. It was about 37% in 1990 and has shrunk to about 12% today. Now, the US Congress is working on passing a set of incentives to bring semiconductor manufacturing back to the US and also to strengthen the semiconductor supply chain. Now, a key factor to this onshoring or reshoring will be sufficient number of trained and experienced workers to support this expansion. Now, to highlight that a little bit further, the needs for semiconductor skills have been in the news recently. TSMC, who is Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, is the largest semiconductor foundry manufacturer in the world, is constructing a brand new facility in Arizona. And they announced just recently a 3 to 6 month schedule delay due in part to labor shortages. Now, New York Creates, which is a non-for-profit, is headquartered in Albany, New York, has over $15 billion in investments from New York State, its partners, over the last 20 years to establish public and private partnerships for semiconductor-related research, also to attract investments for economic development into New York, and also to foster education and workforce development programs to support semiconductors in related nanotechnology areas. Now, New York Creates works with a wide variety of partners, as you can see, industrial to academic, and it's there to leverage the semiconductor infrastructure that's there, as well as the technical people assets to create internships, experiential training, and education content for engineers and technicians in the semiconductor ecosystem. Next slide, please. As the semiconductor industry grows in the US, hopefully with the aid of these new US incentives, the industry is going to need many, many more people, as well as reskilling or upskilling of the existing population. These skill needs span everything from construction for building these multi-billion-dollar facilities, to chip designers, to technicians and engineers who conduct the research and development and run these manufacturing fabs. New York universities and colleges graduate a tremendous number of STEM graduates and associate degree graduates every year. The key is to get these students aware and interested in careers in the semiconductor industry through targeted engagements, with targeted academic curriculum, and through experiences with microelectronics companies, and early K through 12 focus on STEM connections to the industry. Next slide, please. Now, as an example of workforce development programs here in New York, NEATEC, which stands for the Northeast Advanced Technological Education Center, is supported out of SUNY Polytechnic Institute by Professor Bob Geer, and is funded in part by NSF, DoD, SUNY, and the participating companies who work with them. And they've effectively supported the education and training needs for the semiconductor engineers and technicians in New York State. Now, NEATEC develops and distributes training content to the community colleges, who then go in and tailor it to the specific needs of regional companies. For example, training of equipment and facilities technicians has been ongoing for over 8 years with Global Foundries just up the road. Also, training was recently developed through Mohawk Valley Community Colleges and has been deployed to Wolfspeed for their brand new fab, which is under construction in Marcy, New York. NEATEC works with New York Creates on internships using our 300mm facilities in Albany. And NEATEC has worked to stand up a DoD skill bridge program, which is called VET Semiconductor Training and Experience Program at Fort Drum. It provides training to soldiers as they transition out of the military service and places them at semiconductor employers for an 8-week internship. Now, these programs are highly effective. They're very cost-efficient means to train engineers and technicians for the semiconductor ecosystem. These type of programs are very flexible in content and very scalable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doug. We're now going to turn to Hank. Hank, the floor is yours.
Thank you. The perspective I bring to this panel is that of a leader of a large and successful innovation initiative in a second-tier city. For 5 years, until a few months ago, I chaired the board of Cortex, the Cortex Innovation District. For 5 years before that, I was the vice chair. Next slide, please. Cortex is a partnership of the City of St. Louis, Washington University in St. Louis University, and the University of Missouri St. Louis, BJC Healthcare System, and the Missouri Botanical Garden. Washington University is and has always been the lead partner. Cortex is a 203-acre innovation district. You're seeing about 50 of it in this picture, which includes 2 million square feet of buildings complete or under construction, 6,000 jobs, and 435 companies. Its strengths are in biotech, ag tech, IT, and cybersecurity. It is a diverse innovation community in firm size as well as industry. In total, there are well over 200,000 square feet of innovation space and startup lab space. Next slide. By any standards, Cortex has been a success. Cortex created thousands of new jobs for the St. Louis region. Cortex revitalized a mostly abandoned manufacturing site in the center of the city. Cortex contributed strongly to the revitalization of the communities surrounding the district. Cortex made it easier for its university partners to recruit and retain talent. Cortex has contributed to its partner universities becoming notable for their academic programs in entrepreneurship and innovation. Cortex has generated well over $75 million in new tax revenue to support essential public services in the city and state. It has even led to a nationally acclaimed restaurant. But it is not perfect. It has contributed to growth in St. Louis far more than it has contributed to racial equity. Next steps for Cortex include a new commitment to wealth building among historically marginalized communities. Why has Cortex been successful? I believe there are a number of reasons which can be summarized into three categories: opportunity, geography, and leadership. Next slide, please. On the opportunity side, St. Louis has a very strong base in research in biotech and ag tech to build on. Washington University School of Medicine, located next door, is one of the largest recipients of NIH research funds in the United States. This follows from the work that Simon noted. This is a case where we're commercializing a base of technology that existed. On the geography side, Cortex was built in an area which has almost no residents and a great amount of vacant land. Very little relocation was required. It is simply very much easier to do this kind of wholesale community building in an area where relocation is not necessary. In addition, while the site itself was primarily abandoned, Cortex is surrounded by amenities, including dense, diverse, vibrant neighborhoods, and 3 of its partner institutions. The other reasons for success have to do with leadership. The sponsoring institutions invested $29 million in the formation of the district, giving it a jump start. The city of St. Louis was enormously supportive, both through tax incentives and giving the Cortex Board of Directors the right to control land use in the district. The Board of Directors of Cortex has always included the most senior leaders, the CEOs of the sponsoring institutions, as well as other St. Louis leaders. And these CEOs have spent real time and attention. Cortex chose, at what I believe was the right time, to engage with a commercial real estate partner who could help it recruit firms and build space attractive to the private sector. Recruiting private businesses is not a core competency of the original partner. And last, Cortex committed, under the leadership of its long-term CEO, to become a vibrant mixed-use community that contained a hotel, restaurants, and an activated green space. Such amenities are essential to drawing talent. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hank. And now we're going to turn to our last panelist, Barb, all yours.
Thank you, Dario, and the National Science Board. Today I'm going to go, first of all, start a little back in history and talk about a partnership that started the Department of Energy, and that's the Manhattan Project. It was an early example of a public-private partnership between scientists and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It was conducted at more than 30 sites. I think many of those sites were on the chart that Simon showed. Across the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. It initiated the atomic age with its focus on the use of atomic energy to end World War II, but more importantly, it created the legacy in the form of DOE's national laboratories. It was also during the Manhattan Project that John von Neumann advocated for the creation of a mathematics program to support the continued development of applications for digital computing, in order to make the most advanced computational resources available to scientists and engineers. And this laid the groundwork for the computational science and high-performance computing, which are key areas of my program today. But DOE has continued to build on its legacy of partnerships and building national capabilities, and I'd like to highlight just a few. Certainly the partnership that we have today with 6 laboratories, industry, and academics, where we are creating an exascale ecosystem for the nation. More recently, our quantum and computing networking initiative has grown out of our basic research in the Office of Science and it supports our long history of deploying scientific high-performance computers and research networks that connect our national laboratories and large scientific user facilities in their national experiments. It's the same expertise and resources that have been called upon many a times to provide insight into national and international crises. For example, from those like the Deepwater Horizon oil spill to the Fukushima nuclear reactors, or nuclear disaster, to name a few. More recently, DOE's laboratories have pooled their high-performance resources with those from cloud providers, industry, and other federal agencies to combat COVID-19. And through this partnership formed the COVID Hpc Consortium partnership. Next slide, please. And it's that partnership I'd like to spend the rest of my time discussing. As noted, we have 43 consortium members in the High Performance Computing Consortium. And if you noticed on the timeline at the bottom, it was established very quickly. The consortium was formed to coalesce at that time many ad hoc and defocused efforts that were around in several smaller consortiums to fight COVID-19. It ramped up quickly and in an agile way, but more importantly, I think to note, the reason it could go very quickly was there was no formal agreement. And let me repeat, each partner, including the international partners, just agreed to provide computing resources, not funding, and support the projects on their system. One of the other reasons that we were able to be established so quickly was the fact that we were able to use existing resources, the NSF, the EXCEED program, to support proposal submission and review. Through the consortium, we have accelerated programs in both basic understanding of the virus and its host interactions and early stage drug development, namely university groups and to more limited extent to small companies. More recently, the board members have recognized the power of what we created and the integral part that it could play in future crises, and envision what they called a national strategic computing reserve that could be modeled after the U.S. Merchant Marine or Civil Reserve Air Fleet. And it would involve building and maintaining sufficient infrastructure and human capabilities to be called up at a moment's notice to fight the next crisis. Since OSTP, if we go to the next slide, since OSTP was a member of the consortium, they released a request for information to select community input about what people thought of the proposed National Strategic Computing Reserve. Of course, the consortium submitted a plan for the NSCR based on our lessons learned. Most importantly, the need for ongoing engagement with a broader stakeholder community such as FEMA, NIH, or CDC in this example. And the access to relevant data, and the need for lightweight agreements to protect intellectual property. The RFI was consolidated into the National Strategic Computing Reserve Blueprint, which was released in October of 2021. As the diagram on the right indicates, the NSCR would allow us to move beyond a one-off scenario where national labs, agencies, or industries are approached to use their expertise and resources to address a single natural crisis to one where there's a standing public-private partnership ready to provide high-performance computing resources, software tools, data as an integral part of any solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barb. And many thanks to our exceptional panelists for sharing their experiences and recommendations. The presentations will be available on NSB's website, as well as a standalone video of the panel session that we just had. And at this point, we'll start the Q&A. And I would like to ask the board members to please turn on your videos. And please raise your virtual hand when you have a question. And I'll make sure to pass it along. Okay, I see Matt already quick to the hand. So Matt, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dario. It's a question for Simon. I was fascinated by the map of the 102 potential new emerging mega hubs. And I bet, I don't know if you can get it back there, but I bet you that that's probably pretty correct. I was trying to memorize some of them. But what I'm not sure of is how much different is that map from just a map of the sort of major urban centers in the country that don't already have hubs? Or maybe you added some more factors in there. I don't know, the presence of the higher education institutions or tech training or something. So you must be saying something more than just, here's a bunch of cities that stand to in line to become new tech hubs. Tell me what other factors, how you picked those 102.
Well, the good news is, Matt, we're sending you a copy of the book so you can see the whole
Yes.
presentation of that.
Excellent.
And also anybody who's interested can go to our website and play with the different criteria, particularly because we think, the main issues are exactly who's got good science programs, who has a lot of college educated people, but also who has land where you can actually build and develop. So we put house prices in there. That excludes some big urban areas, Matt. And we also put quality of life in, like commuting time, for example, again, to try and get at that. Now, people may not like that element of the index. That's fine. They can go to the website and make their own index without that. But you're right. We're looking at big urban areas. We're looking at major research universities. Not all of them are in the largest urban areas, of course. And we're looking at places that have land to build. I mean, I think what we heard from Hank and Cortex is exactly the kind of initiative that we're flagging as saying there's a really good track record around this kind of public-private partnership, but you need land and you need the right to develop the land and use the land, as Hank outlined.
Thank you. Ellen.
First, thanks to all the panelists for those really, really interesting presentations. Certainly makes us want to learn more. So I think my question is maybe both for Doug and for Hank. And you kind of described the partnerships in New York and St. Louis as they exist. And I'm curious about how does it get started? What is the critical factor that allows something like this to really start up and grow? Do you need a government partner right from the beginning? Is industry support critical? I realize it may be different in each case, but I'd like to hear a little bit about that.
Well, I can start and Doug can follow. I think this can be done in many ways. And my knowledge of the successful innovation districts around the country says that there is not a clear formula. In the case of St. Louis, this was led by a coalition of the universities. It was the leading nonprofits, the three major universities, one of the largest healthcare system, although there are other large healthcare systems, and that led this effort. There was also a very important individual involved in the early period, a couple of very important individuals, including Bill Danforth, who had been the former chancellor of Washington University. And it came out of the history is kind of interesting. It came out of a trip that a couple of these leaders took, including Bill, to Kendall Square 25 years ago. And Kendall Square 25 years ago was not Kendall Square today. But their view was, if that could happen there, and there was the research power of the St. Louis area in ag tech and biotech, we could do something far larger than we had done before. Really follows Simon's kind of argument that we could commercialize that degree of technology. It also turned out that there was this large area of abandoned land that turned out to be in a very interesting place between Washington University Medical Center and St. Louis University's campus in the sort of center of the city. So, and the really unusual thing about this partnership are twofold. One is that the institutions were willing to invest $29 million in that activity out of core funds. And this wouldn't have happened without that. I mean, I want to be quite clear, because that allowed a startup, it allowed to buy land, it allowed to hire a staff, etc. And the second thing is that the city of St. Louis was convinced by the power of these institutions and their track record as citizens to grant them very considerable land use control. That would not have been done without a long-term record of these institutions being, in the view of the city, good corporate citizens.
Thank you. Doug, your thoughts as well?
Sure. New York, as Hank said, there's no clear playbook here. But in New York, in my lifetime, I think a lot of this began back with Governor Pataki. So it started with leadership focusing major urban areas like Albany and Buffalo and Rochester around certain core technology themes. And Albany happened to be the semiconductor focused area. And then I think next, IBM choosing to partner with New York State to put their R&D into Albany was another major step. I mean, I can't overemphasize the capital that's needed for this sort of industry, whether it's R&D or manufacturing. It's huge. And New York stood behind that, as well as IBM with major investments, both in kind as well as dollars. And so that started the focus on semiconductors in the Albany area. And then I think what further enhanced that were what I'll call for the industry shovel-ready sites throughout New York State. These are sites that are pre-permitted, have the infrastructure needed to build large semiconductor fabs. And one right up the road from Albany was what was chosen by originally AMD, the semiconductor company, and followed on with Global Foundries to build a manufacturing facility there. And that was a draw for the technology and the university system to feed into the fast growth needed for engineers and technicians. And then because of the innovation in this industry is continuing, you don't stand still. You've got to continue to upgrade your skills. Experience is key. And this is where the Global Foundries partnership with SUNY Poly started to create content and to continue to focus on upgrading their skills. And this has continued to grow throughout the region. And most recently, as I mentioned, Wolfspeed, which came into New York from North Carolina, partly because of the R&D structure here, but also because of incentives from New York State to build upon that. So it's a multi-faceted problem that you're trying to solve, but it really needs the university system, it needs leadership, and it needs, in our case, this industry, a lot of capital dollars.
Thank you.
Suresh B.
Thank you very much, Dario. So I have a question for all the panel members. As we are all talking about urban cities getting this kind of innovation, do you have any playbook or thought process how we can pull rural community, also the community colleges, into this innovation so that the geography of innovation is going there also? Can you provide some thought process based on your experience? Not sure.
The question beyond cities, right? So Simon,
Yeah,
I think
beyond cities, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, so we do look at that in our book. I think it's a very important question. And we find that depending on what you think about commuting times, we can get most of America and most Americans within a reasonable commute of the 104 hubs that we identify. So I think that's encouraging. I mean, I think it needs to be continually a priority. I think that you're putting your finger on the right thing with rural community colleges. And that would be ways in which they can be connected, just like in Doug's map, connect the smaller places to medium-sized or bigger hubs as those develop. I think, state level or regional strategies can and should be developed along those lines. Oh, and I should say that we find New York State, upper New York State, and many parts of the Midwest to be very highly ranked in what we do. And that's not because they're the largest areas. That's because you've got many smaller places that can be connected if you do it the right way.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, and
go ahead.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Barb.
Go ahead, Barb.
I was going to say, look, I'm from Iowa, so that's basically a rural area. And I spent a lot of time when I was back in Ames Lab, which is the Department of Energy lab, trying to reach out to, in this case, high schools and connect them and in such a way. And I can say that my partner in doing this was a community college, because at that time they had a wide area. It wasn't, they had an interconnected video system to do distance learning, but it isn't easy. It takes a lot of, travel. And in my case, I was trying to connect high schools. Like I said, it was working with local rural telephone companies to figure out how I could put in a router in their company, and having to actually increase their capacity. So I think part of this infrastructure bill that's really reaching out to build up the rural communities and they're connected to bandwidth is going to help us all reach the rural communities.
Thank you.
I think it's a hard problem, but I think that there are two important things to think. I've done some work in if not rural areas, small cities, places dramatically smaller. I think the key is to identify that they have assets that can lead to innovation. So Akron has done quite well, for example, in creating innovation in the polymer industry, building around despite other real challenges. I think the key is identifying what the asset is that you can build around. What is the firm? What is the educational system? Is there a strength of that research area? And, in the people who work in smaller cities, much smaller cities, that's their job. Frankly, it's pretty obvious if you're in St. Louis that you're going to build off biotech and ag tech. It's a little bit harder process, and you have to really go through the process of kind of thinking through, what can I build off of here? I think most places you can find there are things to build off of. They may not lead to 6,000 jobs, but you can find that you get things to build off of. There may be some places where it's very difficult.
Thank you.
Doug, you had a comment as well?
Yeah. I think in New York, we're blessed with the state university system, which has dozens of community colleges scattered throughout the state. Now, that says for semiconductors, they all don't have necessarily the curriculum that's needed, but you can develop that and pass that on fairly easily. And so in the industry of semiconductors, you don't need all PhDs, but you need technicians, you need what we call workstation operators who actually run the equipment, this multi-million-dollar equipment in the fab. And that training is perfect for setting it up in partnerships with in New York with community colleges that have the right curriculum.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to go to Scott next, and then Julie and Punch also have a hand, so we'll go in that order. So Scott.
Doug, you had mentioned that there was a plentiful supply of tech graduates, but there was a difficulty recruiting them into the semiconductor industry. What were the difficulties with that?
Well, I'll say it very simply. I think a lot of the graduates want to go an easier route and do apps or software work, which seems to have a much faster satisfaction level in terms of developing an app and seeing it produce or run, versus going into semiconductors, which it takes months to run an experiment. It takes months to run a wafer to get a product out. And I think the issue there is, as I said, we've got to start earlier on the benefits of the semiconductor industry as a career path that can be very, very rewarding and very positive, and get more of those STEM graduates focused on that path as opposed to, I'll say, software.
Thanks. It's not what I would have guessed.
Okay, Julia.
Yeah, I'm sort of following up on Suresh Babu's question, having to do with those parts of the country where there are basically no or almost no metropolitan areas. I live in one. The chair of the science board actually lives very close to one as well. That northern part of the West, where there is practically nothing, but there is a large Native American population, and how on earth are we going to bring those people in? And one possible avenue, I'm curious in your thoughts on what have we learned from the pandemic and the remote working and so forth that might help us. Clearly, those people need broadband. I don't even have enough broadband frequently to be able to connect on Zoom, and so that's a real issue. But what are the thoughts in terms of how we can actually get the entire country and not just the ones that are sort of close to a decent sized metropolitan area engaged?
Well, I think, Julia, you just answered your own question, actually, which is, first of all, yes, those areas should be a particular focus because it is particularly difficult to follow the kind of approach we're focused on today. But I think remote work and what we've learned about remote work, Julia, including education, early career, and also what people can do later in their careers, I think that's something that really deserves a lot more attention and support. And I would commend that you and others talk with Ro Khanna, who's a member of Congress for Silicon Valley, actually, but who spends a lot of time working with very remote places and attempting to get them plugged into and working with advanced tech companies. Because I agree with you entirely, Julia. We must not forget these people and these places.
Thank you.
Punch.
Oh, thank you very much, Dario. Great panel. Thank you, panelists, for a wonderful discussion. So first, I wanted to agree that it all starts right with the leadership, Doug, that you mentioned. Having come from Arizona and seen how it changed in the 20 years, I can give you personal anecdotes, but I'm sure my colleagues here, two of whom who also have done similar things in Utah and in Indiana, Suresh and Dan, can also add to this thinking. I have found that economic development organizations and incentives that the state offers and economic development organizations offer has become a huge part of how industry gets attracted from other parts or want to birth in various areas. Otherwise, I find that people who start even in a particular place want to move to the typical places where they find the incentives are better. So this is something that I thought you might also reflect on. I would very much like to listen to your thoughts and comments on that. Clearly, people has been a huge factor that I've noticed at all levels. How can they get good quality people? But I've also noticed them saying that we need ecosystems of a particular type, because as much as we are worried about competition taking over people, but we also want to take away people from other competitors. So we want to have an ecosystem that is synergistic in terms of people all working in a similar set of industry types. It was interesting to me to hear that from people. The next thing I have found, which has made or break, and I would like your thoughts on this too, is infrastructure. You talked about land, Simon, but I've often found that power, when we were trying to attract Tesla, power was what we lost on. And people have talked about water, power, transportation, of course, quality of life. And so that's another thing I found that has been a distinguishing characteristic for people to want to be in a particular place or not. I was going to ask you a question. These were just comments, but question. How much does context play a role? Because when we talk about geography of innovation, which is what we're caring about, we are thinking about new places to birth. So the context for agriculture is Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, Indiana, and so on. So would people think of that context as a place of birthing new innovation ecosystem rather than saying, how can I get more tech everywhere? So I would very much appreciate your inputs on that. And last point that I want to make and leave with that is the other thing that I found startups have always wanted is venture capital access. It's all fine to birth in a particular place. We have had these ecosystems like Arizona where we birth these companies. They go to a $50 million or a $10 million company and they say, well, I want to move to the Bay Area because that's where I can find venture capital. So that has been a huge deciding factor in terms of startups really wanting to stay in regions. So I would very much appreciate your comments. And lastly, I said last, but this is real last. What can NSF and other agencies do? I would very much like your quick thoughts on that too. Thank you so much.
Well, fortunately, we have an answer to all of your questions in one package in our book. And the answer is actually very much to addressing your first point, which is about the incentives we provide to business. So in this country, state and local governments provide over $50 billion a year in a zero-sum game that's basically a race to the bottom, giving away these incentives to businesses, 90+% of whom end up investing in the same place they would have done anyway. All right. So you're just giving away these resources. And our proposal is to turn this around and create a positive sum game where, and this is part of what was in the Endless Frontiers legislation. And there is a debate about to what extent the NSF should be involved versus Department of Commerce versus others and so on. I am not going to get involved in that one, believe me. But the point is that the federal government can have, the DOE, of course, should be a contender. The federal government should have a race to the top where you say, look, we'll provide these additional resources if you have the following pieces lined up. Obviously, strong tech programs and context, really important. That's why, as soon as Hank says ag tech, Missouri, like, oh yeah, of course, that makes sense. You need to have the science, you need to have the land available. Maybe there's other resources for other industries, as you pointed out. Water in the West is always going to be a significant issue. But having races to the top where the federal government is providing catalyst, matching funds, and the state, but you're basically empowering state and local coalitions, exactly the kind that Doug and Hank both talked about, different coalitions in different places, different anchor investors in different places, probably. The key point, though, is going to be venture capital, right? And a very big issue we don't know yet is to what extent our experience with remoteness over the past 2 years has broken this venture capital idea that they have to, it has to be a 2-hour drive from wherever they're based, which is mostly next to Stanford University. So if we've broken that, great. If we haven't, let's get creative and find some new venture capitalists, would be my suggestion.
I think that Simon's right. But let me just try a slightly more localized view. The truth is the most successful innovation districts do a checklist of things well. They have venture capital available. They have basic research available. They have talent, both at the level of doing the work, and they have something that many cities don't have, which is experienced entrepreneurs at taking small companies and growing them to larger companies. They have venture capital available. I think the job of any region is to look at their assets, say, which of these things do you have? What can I build off of to start? And then which of these assets do I have to build, knowing it may take a long time to do it, but it's going to take a long time depending on when you start. So St. Louis, for example, was very thin on venture capital when the first efforts toward developing innovation districts began. And folks have worked on it for years in a variety of ways, which I could talk about offline or in more detail. And now we've gone from it being a major weakness to probably being a push. It's neither a strength nor a weakness. That's a huge improvement over 50 years. But I think every region has to do their own assessment. I mean, if you have cheap electricity, that's a real asset. If you have very expensive electricity, that's a real negative, and that change implies a different strategy.
Thank you.
Okay, Roger.
Yes, thank you, Dario, and thanks to the panel for excellent presentations. I have a couple of comments, but Hank covered a lot of them that I was going to cover because I was at Washington U in the early days when they made the first push towards entrepreneurism, and I kept being told there's going to be this tech district. Well, I abandoned ship and went to San Diego, where there was a lot more going on, to an institute that had committed itself to being an innovative institution in Scripps, and then went back to be part of what Bill Danforth and John McDonnell decided to do again. But what Hank said it was really critical. One, it took visionaries, and two individuals made a difference there. And you might ask, given that McDonnell was from McDonnell Aircraft, why wasn't the fine manufacturing one of the several things that they chose? It was because they saw the future. So individuals make a hell of a difference about which direction things go, and you really do need leadership. But the point that I wanted to come to a couple of things here. We watched what was happening in North Carolina at Research Triangle Park and asked how did that develop? And so that was a top-down approach. The governor was important. Then I saw what was going on in New York that Doug described, and it's a different approach. And here we were in Missouri, where the state didn't want anything to do with it. And so that these local areas developed because of the skill sets, and Hank did a great job in telling us all about that. I'm a biologist in the plant side, and I'm wondering, why have the ag schools not become hubs for innovation in agriculture, the same way that urban areas had become hubs in the tech industry and in biotech? And you can say that's because of lack of leadership at the state level, or you can say there's a mentality going on in the APLU about this. But it seems to me that if we want to look at rural areas, Panch, as you mentioned, that the hubs in the land grant institution and the HBCUs, which are often also in smaller areas, are logicals. The question is, what role can NSF play in that to happen? Barbara's description was a real top-down. It's agencies at the very highest level deciding what we should do. Then you have the bottoms-up approach, which says, okay, I've got 3 guys at the University of Missouri Columbia saying, let's set up a tech hub, which isn't enough. So someplace in between here, there's a learning that we've had from the failures and the investments around Columbia, for example, didn't go anywhere. And why not? University of Illinois Champaign has some, and they've done a pretty good job. Michigan State has done a reasonable job. How do those institutions make things work? And what can the NSF do, and the USDA and DOE and others do to help in rural areas? The bioeconomy is a huge component of the future of this country because of the assets that we have in rural areas. Yet we haven't made that our priority. And I think it's going to take a change in attitude. And I wonder from Simon's perspective, and anyone who wants to comment about those issues, and what might NSF do that can be a trigger to make these rural areas more vibrant.
Look, Roger, I think that's the hot question, science policy question of the moment, because there's a lot of debate in and around Washington about, you need a science piece, you need a commercial piece. Who's going to bring them together? Should it be one agency, or do you have to have coordination, communication between multiple agencies? I am not going to take a view on that because no one will invite me to their parties anymore. But you can see that interface is traditionally not our greatest strength. We've got great science programs. We have some people who do really good commercialization. How do you bring them together better at a local level with state support, so the federal government is a catalyst and it all works? I think you're asking the right question, Roger, and I think you just need to keep pressing, and you need to keep pushing that with the people who provide the funding as well, because a lot of this debate is on Capitol Hill about whom to entrust with this responsibility.
Roger, I think it's the next frontier in developing innovation is these cases of around state universities, many of which are very large research universities, and often in specialized ways, in areas that have clear implications. And I think you gave good examples in the plant science area, is how do they develop their innovation communities? There are very few really vibrant innovation communities around in the non-metropolitan areas. Some of it's hard, but I think this is the next question. And part of it is that state universities have been very reluctant to get into the risk capital game. They've been very concerned about commercialization. They've been very concerned about what they perceive as conflicts of interest in these kinds of decisions. But I think that's a solvable problem.
Yeah,
you look at
said, public investments and risk don't always are not the easiest things to bring together. I think we all acknowledge that. Heather.
Yes, a question kind of for Doug and also Simon. Doug, did some of these innovation areas cross boundaries, and I wonder if the Canadians were involved in your New York effort. And Simon, does your database? I mean, you've got Seattle, Vancouver. Of course, in our area, I'm from El Paso, in one of those state universities, but our region is a huge manufacturing region, but it's across 2 countries. And does your database along the edges of the United States, where you have some hubs or potential hubs, include international data or just US data?
Yeah, let me add a little color to the question around Canadian New York connections. Actually, one of the best examples in New York is in Plattsburgh, New York, which is very northern New York, a few miles from the border and Montreal. And there is a very good collaboration that goes on across the border pre-COVID times, essentially around aerospace. So you've got Bombardier up in Canada working with community colleges and state university connections in Plattsburgh with again, experiential hands-on training for Bombardier in New York that feeds the Canadian ecosystem for these skills. And Bombardier, has expanded now into transportation and other areas, and that continues to this day. So that is an example where the border and the connections are quite strong for, again, a focus in an industry around aerospace and transportation.
Yeah, great question, Heather. Our book focuses on the US and US data in part because we're making the case for federal government funding, a lot of it for science and for places. Now, of course, that could be coordinated with Canada, for example, or I guess potentially with Mexico. Really interesting idea. I've not seen, I think, Doug just gave one of the most compelling examples. I'm not sure that we've seen as much success on this level of cross-border cooperation as we've seen in the RTPs, University of Washington, WashU, and so on. So great idea, worth pursuing. I'm not sure how it'll play in Washington, but let's try.
Suresh Garimella.
Hi. So I'm usually the optimistic one, and so I wasn't going to ask a question because mine's not so optimistic. Maybe it's my concern for my Ukrainian friends that's bothering me today. But so I applaud the successful experiments you've talked about and the effort at DOE. I think large universities are key, and thankfully, several of the Big Ten schools are located in rural areas. I led the Office of Engagement at Purdue for a while, and we were able to attract 5,000, high-paying jobs and companies to the middle of cornfields. But they had Purdue as the attractor. So my question's about what educational institutions can do to lead, the ones that are not like the Purdues or the Utahs or the WashUs, et cetera. If there's a coalition of willing local and state governments, the private sector, necessary resources, and all the other things people mentioned, I think these approaches work well. And there are probably more areas of the country where this can be done. But there are regions where there's a very sparse presence of higher education. And the existing schools, even major state schools, are struggling to just survive and focus on doing their core work and trying to be financially sustainable. So, and there are demographic challenges on top of that, aging populations, fewer high school students, and all of that. So I guess I'm wondering how the millions of folks not engaged or thinking about STEM and innovation can be pulled in these less served rural areas, such as, say, the rural South. Is there hope? And so maybe it's beyond the remit of this panel, but it's something I worry about. And I'm still curious what an NSF can do in this space. So multiple questions there. Sorry to be a wet blanket, but I thought I had to say this.
Suresh, there's definitely hope. And I think that the fact that 68 senators from 41 states want to be part of this kind of initiative is extremely encouraging because they're speaking to their hopes and fears of their constituents. And, to be honest, not everyone can get on the front wagon of this train whenever it pulls out of the station, right? But if we have some demonstration effects, and if we really push, I think at the border that you and others are flagging here about relatively remote places or places that are not obvious as the next tech hub and connecting them into things that go well, I think people will start to get the picture and understand. And frankly, if we want R&D to be productive and high impact in this country, you've got to get it away from the highest real estate places because those prices are just going to keep going up. You're going to spend more and more of your budgets on the square footage and on paying people to live in these places that are pretty difficult already. It's a vast country with enormous number of people, like you say, who want to participate. So let's figure out how to give them the opportunity. And I think having federal government provide catalyst funding so that state and local come up with their own initiatives to answer your question and solve the problem, that seems very fair and transparent and completely appropriate, whether it's the NSF, Department of Commerce, DOE, all of the above, some combination, I think is slightly above my pay grade, but it can absolutely be done.
If I could
Barb,
add something. Yeah, and this goes back to my experience with the high school program. And sometimes it just starts with one person, because we were able to put computers in the schools and connect them to, outside of the rural areas. The amazing thing is because we were really looking at trying to get more disadvantaged and underserved populations involved in STEM education. And because we did that, and because they can connect to other states, because it was a 5-state program, we had a number of people who went through the program that we heard, I wouldn't have gone to college if I hadn't had this experience. I figured that I could do this. And sometimes it just takes, putting a connection in a high school, and having technicians work with schools or teachers so that they see what they can do with this. That makes a difference. And I think, the best that we can do is to do whatever we can do to make a difference in those areas.
So
If I could just...
Could I add a different slant on this, which is part of what we think of, and certainly what Cortex is, we think of innovation as being biotech, ag tech, IT dominated. And frankly, it's very hard to do biotech if you're not close to a major medical center. But there are a lot of industries in America. The mining industry, for example, the construction industry. The construction industry has had negative productivity over the past 50 years. The construction industry is 15% of the world's GDP. If you can figure out how to build faster and build cheaper, you will have a huge contribution globally. And that doesn't have to be centered next to MIT or Stanford or Washington University. In fact, because of the cost of land in those places, they're actually not very good places to do kind of prototyping or experimenting. So one of the things I think of is to think about innovation in a broader set of industries that are more widely distributed and where other things can be of value. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. I'm gonna pass it on to Carl to ask the last question before we go into the concluding remarks. So Carl.
Thank you very much. I wanted to just point out another way in which you can improve and bring talented people into less populous areas. In the 1950s, Colorado, as you see in my backdrop, was a lovely place to live, but there was nothing there. And the federal decisions were made to delocalize the federal government into the middle of the country. And that made a huge difference. Everything from IBM to improving the university system. And in the end, it built a technology hub, largely from a point of view of defense. And this is not as relevant today as it was 50 years ago, but it gives you a sense of the role the federal government can play in helping to make a big difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl. So in the last few minutes, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to take just 60 seconds to leave us with their final thought or observation, kind of a take-home message, so to speak, that you believe is vital for all of us to remember as we move forward. And this time we'll go in reverse order. We're going to start with Barb.
Thank you, Dario. Yeah, this has been a very interesting conversation and one that hits extremely close home to me since I'm from a rural community, and unfortunately no longer living there. But many of my relatives were teachers, and all I can say, and Iowa has an extremely strong community college system, and I had that fortune. I was fortunate to partner with many of those when I was back in the state. So I think the important thing is to continue the discussion and look to what we can do as we can connect the rural communities to broadband and things like that, and how we can bring the conversation to them and let them be part of the answer and the solution.
I'm muting here. Thank you very much. Hank, next.
I do think that I also have found it a very interesting conversation. And thank you for the questions. So there's much to think about. I think one of the questions, I think there are two questions that I have. One is, how can we empower states to think about this in a more productive way? I think the New York example that was Dan pointed out so powerfully is a fairly rare example. And unfortunately, a number of the more rural states, I think, have been less productive on that. And the second question, which comes from Roger's comment, is how do many of the most successful innovation districts were begun by entrepreneurial individuals, be they civic leaders, be they university heads, etc. And how can we empower people to put this on their long-term list, understanding that for many universities it's very difficult because they're suffering from short-term pain, which is enormous. But I think those are the two things I come away with, is how can we induce states, and how can we get a little longer-term thinking and induce local action.
Thank you very much. Doug.
Yeah, let me start with, I think we're on the cusp, and Dario, you know this well, of potentially the US government through the Department of Commerce investing billions of dollars into the semiconductor industry, both for expanding manufacturing in the US as well as the National Semiconductor Technology Center and packaging, which is key on the innovation side. And what I worry about, it would be an absolute tragedy after spending these billions of dollars on infrastructure and equipment investments to strengthen the US industry. It would be an absolute tragedy if we don't have the intellectual assets to innovate and continue to run these manufacturing facilities efficiently. So we're on the cusp of a large experiment, probably not seen in a long time since what Barb talked about with the Department of Energy, that's going to focus on semiconductors. And I think the models in front of us that can touch upon many of the aspects we were talking about today to improve.
Thank you, and that speaks also to the urgency, right, of this moment of unique investments, and to coalesce all the wisdom to make sure we do this right.
Sure.
Let me pass it on finally to Simon.
In October 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world and all of our predecessors by launching Sputnik. And in the reassessment of US national priorities and science funding that followed was a remarkable bipartisan agreement, which became legislation as the National Defense Education Act of 1958, that was the motivation, which was exactly the same as Barbara articulated for you today, which is how do we get everyone everywhere connected into science, not just so we can have more people get PhDs, but also because there's a lot of really good jobs that can be created across that scientific the scientific function and the way in which we do science. I think we need to go back to that. And I'm glad that you're having this discussion. I think it's great that you're focusing on community colleges. I think providing these opportunities is absolutely essential. I think there's a fantastic role for the NSF to play. So I commend you for this effort, and please do keep at it. And I think figuring out what the secret sauce of what Barbara did and scaling that up, as well as, of course, what Hank and Doug have done, I think that's a fantastic way forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for this energetic conversation. The insights that you have shared with us today will inform the work we do to address our Vision 2030 goal of expanding the geography of innovation in the United States. And as we look forward to NSF's new directorate, we must remember that innovation partnerships are built and sustained best when the passion for STEM is built and maintained starting in elementary school and moving beyond, and when investment in local communities are built from core strengths, as Hank has pointed out today. I look forward to the board's continuing work in the area of innovation partnerships, and thanks again to our wonderful panelists for their thought-provoking presentations and work on this crucial issue. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Simon, Doug, Hank, and Barbara, for this really important and informative discussion. And we really appreciate you offering your time and the benefit of your experience. Your comments reinforce that partnerships aren't a one-size-fits-all, which we knew. But of course, the specific experiences that you have are really informative to us and shows that there's multiple ways to think about success and innovation. And I hope we can continue to engage with you as we move forward with our own efforts on partnership and expanding the geography of innovation. A big thanks to Roger and Dario, of course, and as well as our board staff who coordinated and arranged this session, Alexandra Surcell, Reba Bandapadai, and Nadine Lim.